Cain, from the Abrahamic religious traditions, the firstborn son of Adam, and more infamously, the first murderer, with his slaying of his brother Abel, has a lot of associations connected to him. But one association that is less known, but still rather popular, especially in popular fiction, is his association with vampirism. And you can see this in works such as George R.R. Martin's novel Fever Dream, where vampires are descendants of Cain, and vampires are also descendants of Cain in Vampire the Masquerade, the famous tabletop RPG made by the company White Wolf, though now the property is owned by Paradox instead of White Wolf. Furthermore, you also see Cain being the first vampire in the DC Comics universe as well, and in the anime and novel Shiki, Cain is also associated with the beginning of vampirism. So there is quite a widespread popular view of viewing Cain as the first vampire, or as the originator of vampirism in the world. Vampire here being an immortal blood-sucking monster that was once human, but due to a spreading curse got transformed into this sort of blood-sucking monster. And the originator of this curse would be Cain, making everyone that got cursed from his curse and got cursed from them his descendants in a sense. But where did this view of Cain originate? Where did these beliefs about Cain being vampire-like or being the first vampire originate? Actually, the answer to this is that it's very hard to pinpoint it. And there is a lot of material here regarding Cain, where it could originate from folklore, theological interpretation, and from Jewish and Christian literature. From canonical biblical texts to texts that are only canonical in certain traditions of Christianity and or Judaism, to completely apocryphal literature that no longer is considered to be holy scripture by any now living sect of Judaism and Christianity. I even looked into examples of Islamic literature and Islamicate Arabic folklore when I did research for this video. So I went through a lot of material where Cain is associated with various themes that could be considered associated with vampires and vampirism. And let me tell you, there is a lot of material where you could argue that Cain is presented to be very vampire-like in certain aspects. And this material is so vast and often so filled with various contradictory lore and traditions and interpretations that going through it all in high detail would be very hard and would be too much for this singular video to do. So what I will do instead is I will discuss some general themes and utilize the closest literature to these themes and discuss the clearest examples of Cain being vampire-like or having connections to vampirism and vampiric themes in various Abrahamic religious traditions. But I think the best place to start off discussing Cain and vampirism would be with the original story about Cain and his slaying of his brother, as found in Genesis 4. And the man knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, and said, I've gotten a man with the help of the Lord. And again she bore his brother Abel, and Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. And in process of time it came to pass that Cain brought of the fruit of the ground an offering unto the Lord, and Abel he also brought of the firstlings of his flock, and of the fat thereof. And the Lord had respect unto Abel and to his offering, but unto Cain and to his offering he had no respect. And Cain was very wroth, and his countenance fell. And the Lord said unto Cain, Why art thou wroth, and why is thy countenance fallen? If thou dost well, shall it not be lifted up? And if thou dost not well, sin coucheth at the door, and unto thee is its desire, but thou mayest rule over it. And Cain spoke unto Abel his brother, and it came to pass, when they were in the field, that Cain rose up against Abel his brother, and slew him. And the Lord said unto Cain, Where is Abel thy brother? And he said, I know not. Am I my brother's keeper? And he said, What hast thou done? Thy voice of thy brother's blood crieth unto me from the ground. And now cursed art thou from the ground, which hath opened her mouth to receive thy brother's blood from thy hand. When thou tiltest the ground, it shall not henceforth yield unto thee her strength. A fugitive and a wanderer shalt thou be in the earth. And Cain said unto the Lord, My punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, thou hast driven me out this day from the face of the land, and from thy face shall I be hid, and I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer in the earth. And it will come to pass that whosoever findeth me will slay me. And the Lord said unto him, Therefore, whosoever slayeth Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord set a sign for Cain, lest any finding him should smite him. And Cain went out from the presence of the Lord, and dwelt in the land of Nod, on the east of Eden. As you can see in this initial story as found in Genesis, it is a story about murder and bloodthirstiness, which you could easily parallel or connect to a vampire's literal bloodthirstiness, as being a stand-in for this initial murder, this initial act of bloodthirstiness, metaphorically. Furthermore, and even more importantly almost, is that this story contains a strong blood theme. When Cain spilled his brother's blood, the earth became cursed as soon as the blood hit the ground. In a sense, the earth was left drinking Abel's blood. Hence, there is a theme here of blood drinking. Even if it is the earth that is drinking it, rather than Cain, there is still this idea about drinking blood connected to murder. Furthermore, should Cain attempt to farm the land, the earth will not yield produce for him when attempting that, as kind of a revenge for having been forced to feed on the blood of Abel, as a revenge for the killing of Abel. Not only does this deal with themes about revenge and the spreading of violence due to killings and bloodshed, which could be very easily connected to ideas about vampires spreading their curses. There is also the fact that Cain, through this act of having made the earth taste the blood of Abel, is now forced to depend upon something else than what the earth is producing. And taken in the most literal sense, he would be forced to feed upon the flesh and blood of creatures, maybe even other humans, instead of being able to live off the land. And you can also interpret these lines in a broad sense as the ground or the land not even yielding animals, as animals are sometimes connected to being of the land just like plants are, but humans are considered different in creation. In a lot of interpretations of the Bible, as humans are considered creations in the image of God, and the earth and nature generally, including all the plants and animals, are considered subordinate to humanity. But Cain, through the vicious act of killing his brother, could be considered to have lost his right of superiority over nature, his right to be able to feed upon nature and take sustenance from nature, as the yields of the ground can be interpreted as the yields of the entirety of nature, leaving him only with the ability to feed upon other humans, and in a sense reducing him into a beast that, like the predators of nature, preys upon humanity, which is very close to a vampire. After all, a vampire is a predatory creature that feasts upon humans, like a beast. But on the theme of preying upon humans and blood drinking, it actually goes a lot deeper than just the story in Genesis, and is found even more explicitly in later works and later descriptions of this tale. For example, in the dream of Eve, in the apocryphal tale of the Apocalypse of Moses, in the chapter 1:2:2. I have seen in a dream this night the blood of my son Amilabus, who is styled Abel, being poured into the mouth of Cain, his brother, and he went on drinking it without pity. But he begged him to leave him a little of it, yet he hearkened not to him. And here we have a literal description about drinking blood. And in certain medieval interpretations of the Cain and Abel story, Cain is viewed as having committed cannibalism, as having eaten the flesh of Abel or having drunk the blood of Abel. You can see this in this medieval depiction of these traditions. Cain is thus heavily associated with blood drinking and cannibalism, in addition to murder, which, a vampire is literally a creature that is cannibalistic, that feeds on the blood of others to sustain itself, just like Cain is said to have feasted upon the blood of Abel and his later victims, when he could no longer feed upon the fruits of the ground, on the fruits of nature, limiting him to only living upon other humans, hence making him very vampire-like in his existence. If not, by definition, a vampire, depending upon how you define that term. But the definition of a cursed human being that feeds upon other humans could be applied to both a vampire and to Cain in these traditions. Hence, the possibility of making a connection here is quite clear. Furthermore, the sign or mark of Cain that God puts on him have in certain traditions been interpreted as God giving Cain a sort of immortality, because God promises revenge on anyone that would touch Cain in creation, and this includes the angel of death. And as the angel of death does not want sevenfold vengeance to befall him, he will not approach Cain and take him in when Cain would normally die. So Cain is cursed with immortality in certain interpretations, just like vampires are cursed with a sort of immortality as well. Hence, it's quite easy to make parallels between them here. Furthermore, the immortality in certain traditions was not total for Cain either, as in certain traditions, instead of gaining immortality, he is just offered protection until he is killed at certain moments in history later. For example, in the Book of Jubilees, Cain murdered his brother with a stone. Afterwards, Cain was killed by the same instrument he used against his brother, by the same weapon of choice he used to murder his brother, because his house crumbled and fell upon him, and he was killed by stones falling upon him. In the Book of the Jubilees, Cain faces his end in a rather specifically ironic way to die, killed by a very specific instrument. And being killed by a specific instrument of killing is a reoccurring theme in a lot of vampire folklore and traditions regarding vampires too. So there is some similarity here as well. And in a lot of older vampiric folklore, stones are actually used to kill vampires, or at least to weigh them down so that they do not leave their places of burial. In addition, in Ethiopian folklore, there are stories about evil creatures, even some vampire-like ones, getting killed by getting stoned in the head. And the Book of Jubilees is still a canonical work in the Ethiopic Tawahedo Church. So there is a possibility that certain vampiric associations with Cain could originate from Ethiopic biblical traditions, or due to memories of biblical traditions that were later deemed to be non-canonical within the Roman church tradition. because a lot of non-canonical biblical works actually survived and were used as a point of reference for popular Christian religion in Europe, even up to and beyond the late medieval period, making it not impossible that the Book of Jubilees actually could have been studied also in medieval Europe and not only confined to Ethiopia, where it is used today by the Tawahedo Church as well as Ethiopic Jews. And speaking about Jews and Judaism, there are actually various traditions and interpretations that connect Cain to various animals or to having animal traits. Cain is, for example, connected to dogs, who are considered as sinful, murderous creatures in Jewish traditions. Cain also grows a horn, as if he was reduced to being a mere beast. And in certain Jewish traditions, Cain is actually killed by his grandson, Lamech, who mistook him for being a wild beast because he looked so much like an animal. Cain is thus associated with beasts and animals, such as dogs and wolves and horned animals too. A lot of vampire myths have been connected to animals, and vampires being beast-like in their appearances. And it should be known that werewolf myths and vampire myths have been heavily associated with each other, and in certain traditions considered to be the same creature as well. And speaking about Cain being associated with canines like dogs and wolves, they are carriers of diseases such as rabies, which is one of those diseases that are also suspected to be heavily connected to vampirism as well, to be the disease behind a lot of suspected vampire cases and myths, as rabies causes you to be aggressive and sometimes causes you to bite others and infect others, and can be connected to this vampiric theme of vampires being like a disease that preys upon humanity and spreads through bites. Consequently, there is this possible connection between Cain, canines, rabies, and vampire myths here too, with vampires being bestial monsters. And on the subject of monsters, but now outside of the Jewish tradition, the Anglo-Saxon Beowulf poem, probably from around the 8th century, describes Cain as the father of bloodthirsty monsters, among them the monster Grendel, which is killed by Beowulf. Cain is described in the poem as the father of monsters, and vampires or vampire-like creatures could reasonably fit in the definition of monsters. Actually, generally, in several Abrahamic traditions, the Cainites, descended from Cain, are described as exceedingly wicked generally, being prone to commit murder and various other foul deeds, similar to how vampires are wicked. And there are various connections between Cain and the Cainites to various post-flood peoples, such as peoples in Mesopotamia, who were infamous for creating brutal empires that practiced blood sacrifice. So there is a blood connection here too. And continuing on about Cain's children more directly from before the flood, the Maccabean from the Ethiopic biblical tradition states that God destroyed Cain's children in the deluge due to their sinful and bloodthirsty nature. And the book of Genesis describes the bloodthirsty nature of Cain's grandchildren, with his great-grandson Lamech bragging about taking murderous vengeance upon others. And on the subject of being murderous and committing murder, the initial murder that Cain committed against his brother, the reasons for committing that murder are actually somewhat divergent in certain traditions, and not simply Cain committing the murder out of envy for his brother's sacrifice being accepted but his not. But rather, some traditions actually mention Cain having killed Abel because of jealousy, because both desired the same woman. This can be read in the first book of the Ethiopic Maccabean, as well as in the book of Adam and Eve, which is very similar to the Maccabean description, in that Cain killed his brother out of a desire for a woman. And lustful sexual desire is actually quite vampire-like if you compare it, the lusting for women, to the lust for blood found in vampires as a kind of parallel. Especially as sexuality has often been connected to vampirism, as in both cases you have the thematic exchange of bodily fluids, the release of blood, as well as the connection between sexuality and the spreading of diseases. Just like vampirism could be argued to originate from ideas about spreading diseases, and the curse of vampirism spreading from one carrier to another through bodily contact, through an act of penetration that draws blood and infects the other. I mentioned the book of Adam and Eve before. In that work, there is furthermore another connection between Cain and blood. But as to Cain, ever since he had killed his brother, he could find no rest in any place, but went back to Adam and Eve, trembling, terrified, and defiled with blood. Defiled with blood, and blood will always be close to Cain and his descendants. And Cain could find no rest in any place, just like the restless dead that vampires are, that have been denied the final rest. But it's not only Cain and his descendants that can be interpreted to have been denied the final rest. As in the first book of Enoch in the Ethiopic traditions, Abel's spirit will lament about his death until Cain's descendants, his seed, are destroyed and no more on the earth. Here, interestingly enough, it is Abel that is quite vampire-like, by being the vengeful spirit of a murder victim. Murder and vampirism have historically and folklorically been heavily connected to each other, as vampires have in many myths been the vengeful spirits coming back from a murder, as a representation of the cycle of vengeance and bloodshed. Going from this interpretation, you could say that Cain is the first causer of a being that is vampire-like, as through his act of murder he makes Abel into a spirit of vengeance upon himself and all his descendants. Evil begets evil, just like a vampire creates new vampires by draining the blood and killing others. And speaking about evil, do not be like Cain, who belonged to the evil one and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his own actions were evil and his brothers were righteous. From John 3:12. Belonged to has here been interpreted in certain Christian traditions as Cain being a literal son of the devil, rather than just being generally evil. And vampirism and the devil have been closely connected to each other in folkloric traditions, where people making deals with the devil or being the children of the devil are more prone to rise as vampires than others. There also exist similar ideas about Cain in various Jewish traditions as well. Furthermore, there are esoteric and folkloristic views on Cain that seem pretty modern and pretty lacking in scriptural basis, but that view Cain as a son of Lilith, the first created woman that refused subordination under Adam. There are also traditions where Cain and Lilith meet each other and mate, creating a lot of monsters and demonic offspring. And Lilith, like Cain, is a figure that just naturally lends itself to a connection to various monster folklore, as Lilith is connected to myths about cannibalism, child murder, and many vampire-like legends in her own right. And Lilith is associated with, or even a derivation of, the Mesopotamian Lilith and Lilittu, which are disease-bearing wind spirits, and vampirism and disease have a lot of connection with each other in various folklore. Furthermore, Lilith is also connected to Ereshkigal, the god queen of the underworld in Mesopotamian mythology, a goddess of death and the dead, which can further be connected to vampires as undead creatures. Cain, just by being associated with Lilith, becomes associated with a lot of the vampiric themes and myths connected to Lilith, just as a mere result of proximity. So there is a connection to vampirism through Cain's connection to Lilith here too. Something which is even used in the background lore for the Vampire the Masquerade tabletop game, where Lilith is involved in a process that makes Cain, the first murderer, into the first vampire, after he met her wandering in the land of Nod. Speaking about the land of Nod, and Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Nod, on the east of Eden. The presence can here be interpreted as the literal light of God. Hence, Cain was banished to the shadow, as God is associated with the sun and light a lot in biblical traditions. And the land of Nod can be seen as the night. And furthermore, Cain was banished to the east, where the sun rises, laying an additional layer of punishment upon him as he can't stand in the light. The light of God, as represented in the sun, and as depicted on this artwork by William Blake from the 19th century, which connects to ideas about Cain and his descendants being sensitive to light and being connected with, for example, albinism too, that often causes light sensitivity as well. Now it is mostly later modern vampire myths where vampires have clear sunlight weaknesses and can't stand sunlight without dying. Though there are some older vampire myths where sunlight does weaken vampires or actually harm them. So it is not entirely exclusive to modern vampire myths. So you could say that Cain and his descendants actually share this common weakness to sunlight with vampires, in at least some folkloric traditions, and in modern beliefs and depictions about vampires. And thus it is not hard to see how you could connect Cain to vampires through this shared weakness to the sun. Furthermore, as I mentioned before regarding light sensitivity and albinism being connected to Cain and his descendants, albinism can make you appear very pale, almost corpse-like, and thus you could connect that trait also to vampires as well. I also mentioned earlier that I went through Islamic and Islamicate traditions regarding Cain as well, and I actually found some things that can connect Cain to something vampire-like there as well. In the Quran, Cain, or as he is called in Arabic, qabil, goes through kind of a regretful redemption arc of repentance. And as part of his repentance, God instructs Cain, through the use of a crow as a messenger, about how to properly bury his brother. And Cain can here be interpreted as a prophet receiving a message from God regarding proper burial, a character or prophet associated with the proper rites regarding burial of the dead, as well as being an example to mankind about the wrongfulness of murder and how you can redeem yourself by being regretful and asking for the mercy of God. But it is the first association of being associated with proper burials that is important here, because in a lot of Arabic folklore, improper burial is associated with jinn, the demonic fire spirits within Islam, taking revenge for this being done poorly. And often these jinn will kill or even eat people. And in Arabic, a murderous genie is called a ghoul, which by the way is the same word from which, after being borrowed into English, ghoul comes from. And in the borrowing, the ghoul is turned from being a living creature into an undead creature that eats the flesh of the living, which is not that far from a vampire which feeds on the blood of the living Furthermore, the jinn are known to possess the magic to possess bodies, and possibly even corpses. And it would not be out of the ordinary for them to also have the magical ability to reanimate corpses, as a method of punishment for those that did an improper burial. And this would create quite a vampire-like scenario where a reanimated corpse attacks living human beings as a form of revenge. Furthermore, prophets like Cain are said to have the ability to command and control the jinn, giving them orders that they will have to fulfill until the end of days. Orders such as guarding graves and punishing those that would desecrate graves. Also, if you compare to a lot of Western vampire folklore, not burying a body properly is a reoccurring cause of a body returning as a vampire in a lot of folklore. So there is a possible connection here too. As for why you could connect vampirism with Cain, there are so many sources and possibilities for connecting Cain to various aspects of vampirism, as the Cain mythology lends itself to a lot of interpretations, and vampire myths are very broad, and the mythology and folklore surrounding vampires and Cain is so vast that it creates a lot of overlap between them. Hence, there are a lot of possibilities for people to create connections between Cain and vampirism and use these connections in popular media. And this video was based just on some of the connections that I found. And I think that you can find a lot more connections if you really search for them. But the connections that I described in this video were the ones that I found to be the most relevant or interesting ones to discuss as to why someone would associate Cain with vampirism. And I hope you have found this video interesting, where I've gone over the possible connections between Cain and vampires in various source material. I hope to see your comments in the comment section, as well as your questions, and I hope to see you push the like button too. Please do subscribe, as it would help the channel spread awareness about the humanities.
اشتركوا بالقناة من فضلكم.